Arizona Territory, 1898. While every homesteader on the high plateau rushed to throw up standard log cabins before winter, one former cavalry teamster was still building in late September. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. He was constructing an 8-sided structure based on Navajo Hogan design, walls twice as thick as necessary, covered with 12 to 18 inches of packed earth and clay. He positioned his stove in the center, not against the wall like everyone else. He spent 3 months on a shelter others finished in 3 weeks. Then February 1899 arrived. The great Arctic outbreak hit without warning. Temperatures plunged to 24 below zero. 7 brutal days that would break records across the Southwest. Standard log cabins failed within hours once fires died. Families huddled in rooms that dropped to 20 degrees inside. But that fool's mud Hogan? It held comfortable heat for 2 full days after the last stick of wood burned. His neighbors, the same ones who had mocked his dirt pile, came knocking on his east-facing door with their children, seeking refuge from the cold that nearly killed them. What did he understand about thermal mass and heat retention that every other settler missed? And how did his willingness to learn from Navajo builders become the difference between warmth and death on that frozen ridge? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The morning frost still clung to the juniper when Samuel Hartwell walked his claim line for the last time before winter. October 1898 had been unseasonably warm across the Arizona high country, but any man who had hauled freight through Colorado winters knew that luck could turn in a single night. At 43, Hartwell had seen too many teamsters and cavalry units caught unprepared by weather that respected no man's timeline. His 160 acres sat on a windswept plateau between 6,000 and 6,500 feet, close enough to the Fort Defiance agency that he could see smoke from Navajo Hogan scattered across the valley below. His neighbors had finished their cabins weeks ago, standard single-pen construction, 16 by 18 feet, chinked log walls 8 to 10 inches thick with mud and straw. Fast work that followed patterns carried west from Missouri and Arkansas, patterns that assumed a man could always cut more wood when the cold bit deep. But Hartwell had spent too many nights in army shelters that leaked heat faster than green privates could feed the stoves. He had watched good men nearly freeze in structures that looked solid but fought a losing battle against physics every time the fire burned low. Down in the valley, the Navajo families were preparing for winter in their own way. Their hogans, circular or 8-sided log structures covered with thick layers of earth and clay, had weathered these plateaus for generations longer than any white settlement. Hartwell had noticed something during his summer visits to trade for horses. Even on the hottest days, when his own cabin turned into an oven, the interior of a Hogan remained comfortable. And on cool mornings, when his thin-walled cabin chilled within an hour of the fire dying, Hogan families emerged from dwellings that had held their warmth through the night. He had asked questions, carefully, respectfully, knowing that some knowledge came with protocols he barely understood. But Maria Begay, whose family maintained a trading relationship with several Anglo settlers, had explained the principles with the patience of someone teaching a child to read sign. The female Hogan was not just shelter, it was thermal mass wrapped around living space. The logs provided structure, but the earth provided stability. 4 to 8 inches of clay and soil over the entire shell, sometimes more, creating a barrier that absorbed heat slowly and released it the same way. The octagonal shape shed wind better than flat walls. The eastern door honored tradition, but also caught morning sun. The central fire warmed the mass directly rather than fighting drafts along outside walls. When Hartwell asked permission to build like yours for my family, Maria's husband had studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Not just approval, but an offer to guide the work. The Hogan was sacred space, but these particular techniques, reading clay soils, arranging roof logs, managing smoke and moisture, these were survival knowledge that kept families alive. And winter, on the high plateau, did not care about the color of a man's skin. Hartwell staked out his octagon on a slight rise that offered drainage and wind protection. 22 feet in diameter, giving him roughly 380 square feet of floor space, more compact than his neighbors' rectangular cabins, but arranged around a central hearth that would heat the entire volume evenly. He marked 8 corners with stakes, each section roughly 8 feet apart around the circle. The layout looked strange to Anglo eyes accustomed to square corners and parallel walls, but Hartwell trusted what worked over what looked familiar. The timber work came first. 78 juniper and pinyon logs, 6 to 9 inches in diameter, cut from the scattered groves that dotted his claim. These trees grew slowly in the thin soil and dry air, producing dense wood that would shed moisture and settle tightly. He cribbed the walls up to 5.5 feet, each log notched and fitted to the ones below, creating an octagonal shell with minimal gaps. The roof presented the real challenge, building a self-supporting dome without a center post, using logs arranged in shrinking rings that would carry their own weight and the massive earth covering planned for the top. His neighbors stopped by to watch the progress, and their comments grew sharper as the unusual structure took shape. Tom Bradley, whose own cabin had gone up in 3 weeks of hard work, called it the biggest waste of good logs this side of Santa Fe. Others dubbed it the mud igloo, the Indian beehive, jokes about moving into a dirt pile. They could not understand spending months on a single building when winter demanded speed above all else. Every day Hartwell spent notching roof logs was a day he could have been splitting firewood or hunting meat. But Hartwell had calculated the trade differently. His neighbors planned to burn 4 to 6 cords of wood through the winter, feeding their stoves constantly to compensate for thin walls and drafty construction. Hartwell cut only 3 cords, investing the saved labor into thermal mass instead of fuel. He mixed local clay with sand and chopped straw, creating an adobe plaster that he packed between every log and chink. Then came the earthen shell, 12 to 18 inches of compacted soil over the roof and upper walls, sloped to shed rain and snow. 23 tons of earth moved by hand and mule, transformed from dead weight into a heat battery that would store warmth from his stove and release it slowly through the long plateau nights. The interior work finished the system. Hartwell dug the floor down 12 inches, creating a bench around the perimeter wall and reducing the volume of air that needed heating. He positioned his iron stove in the center, venting it through the traditional smoke hole rather than against an outside wall where precious heat would leak directly into the cold. Straw covered the earthen floor, providing insulation against ground cold. The single door faced east, honoring the tradition Maria had explained, but also catching the first warming rays of winter sun. By late November, when the first serious cold began moving down from Canada, Hartwell's Hogan stood complete. Neighbors shook their heads at the strange earth-covered dome that looked more like a natural hill than a proper house. They had their own preparations to finish: final chinking, last loads of firewood, checking chimney draws and stovepipes. They trusted speed and volume, the frontier approach that had carried their families across the plains and through previous winters. Hartwell trusted mass and patience, principles borrowed from people who had never known any other way to survive the high country cold. Neither approach had been tested by what was coming. The rider from Fort Defiance arrived on December 15th with news that made experienced frontiersmen check their firewood stacks twice. Weather Bureau telegraphs from as far east as Kansas and as far north as Montana carried the same warning. An Arctic mass unlike anything in recent memory was building across the northern plains. Temperatures in Dakota Territory had already dropped to 40 below zero. The mass was moving southwest, and the high country of Arizona Territory lay directly in its path. Most winters on the plateau followed predictable patterns. Clear, dry cold that might touch 0 degrees for a few nights each season, followed by warming days that brought temperatures back above freezing. Snow fell and melted in cycles, rarely accumulating more than a foot, except in the deepest drifts. Cattle could still graze between storms, and a well-built fire could warm a cabin through the worst nights with reasonable fuel consumption. Settlers had learned to expect 10 to 15 degrees below zero as the absolute worst case, maybe 20 below, in an extraordinary year. The winter of 1898 to 1899 was proving extraordinary in ways that would reshape weather records across the American West. The Great Arctic Outbreak, as meteorologists would later name it, was already freezing rivers solid from Nebraska to New Mexico. At Fort Apache, Army thermometers registered 15 below zero on December 20th, the coldest reading in the post's official records. At Fort Defiance, the mercury dropped to 24 below on the same night, shattering previous extremes by more than 10 degrees. Samuel Hartwell studied the thermometer mounted on his Hogan's east wall and considered the physics his neighbors had dismissed as foolishness. A standard log cabin presented perhaps 800 square feet of exposed wall surface to the wind, every square foot a potential heat leak. The logs themselves, seasoned pine or juniper, provided decent insulation when properly chinked, but wood had relatively low heat capacity per volume. It warmed quickly when the fire burned hot, but it also cooled quickly once the heat source diminished. Even well-built cabins lost substantial warmth through air infiltration, gaps between logs, around door frames, through roof joints that shifted with seasonal expansion and contraction. The mathematics of heat loss worked against every conventional frontier dwelling. Interior air, heated to comfortable temperatures around 70 degrees, would lose that warmth at a rate determined by the temperature difference between inside and outside air, the surface area exposed to cold, and the thermal properties of the wall materials. When outside air dropped to 20 below zero, a 90-degree differential, even small gaps and thin walls became critical vulnerabilities. A cabin that felt adequately warm at 10 above could become unlivable when the mercury dropped another 30 degrees. Hartwell's Hogan operated on different principles entirely. The earth shell that neighbors had mocked as wasteful overbuilding functioned as thermal mass on a scale no conventional cabin could match. Adobe and compacted clay possessed low thermal conductivity, meaning they conducted heat slowly in either direction. More importantly, they had enormously high heat capacity, the ability to absorb large amounts of thermal energy without significant temperature change. The 23 tons of earth covering his roof and walls could store heat equivalent to burning several cords of wood, then release that stored energy gradually over many hours. The octagonal shape minimized surface area relative to interior volume, presenting less wall space to the wind than a rectangular structure of similar floor area. The thick earthen covering sealed gaps that would leak air in conventional log construction. Most critically, the central stove heated the thermal mass directly rather than fighting heat loss through exterior walls. Warmth from the iron firebox radiated into the clay-covered walls and roof, where it soaked into the earth and became stored energy that would warm the interior long after the fire died to coals. Tom Bradley and the other conventional builders had prepared for winter by cutting additional firewood, 4 to 6 cords per family, stored in covered piles near their cabins. Their strategy relied on continuous combustion to overcome the heat loss characteristics of thin-walled construction. Feed the stove steadily, bank the coals at night, restart the fire if it died completely. It was a proven approach that had carried homesteaders through Montana winters and Colorado blizzards, but it demanded constant vigilance and adequate fuel supplies. Hartwell had cut barely 3 cords, spending the saved labor on perfecting his thermal mass instead. Double-thick chinking between every log, mixed from clay that fired almost ceramic hard in the dry air. Earthen berms around the Hogan's base to eliminate ground-level air infiltration. A thick straw mat over the sunken floor to prevent heat loss into the ground. The door fitted with leather weather stripping and positioned to minimize wind exposure. Every detail designed to trap heat inside the structure and release it slowly rather than demanding constant fuel input. The conventional wisdom made sense in timber country, where firewood cost only labor and trees grew faster than settlers could harvest them. But the high plateau challenged those assumptions. Wood was sparse, widely scattered, and slow to regenerate. A cord of juniper or pinyon represented days of cutting, hauling, and splitting across terrain where horses struggled with loaded wagons. Men who burned 6 cords per winter were gambling that spring would arrive before their wood piles disappeared. As December temperatures continued falling toward the record-breaking lows that would define the great Arctic outbreak, both approaches prepared for their ultimate test. The conventional cabins stockpiled fuel and checked stovepipes, trusting volume of combustion to overcome the physics of heat loss. The single earthen Hogan on the ridge stored thermal energy in its massive walls, trusting principles borrowed from builders who had survived this climate for generations without access to unlimited firewood. The Weather Bureau's final telegram arrived on December 28th, carried by a mail rider whose horse showed ice crystals on its muzzle, despite the animal's heavy winter coat. Unprecedented cold moving south from Canada. Expect sustained sub-zero temperatures across Arizona Territory for the first week of January. Emergency preparations recommended for all settlements above 5,000 feet elevation. Hartwell read the message twice, then walked outside to check his thermometer one more time. 10 below zero at sunset, with the wind rising and clear stars promising even deeper cold by morning. Inside the neighboring cabins, stoves would burn bright through the night, consuming armloads of precious wood every hour. Inside his Hogan, 23 tons of earth were slowly absorbing heat from the day's fire, storing energy that would warm his family long after every conventional fire had burned to ash. The real test was beginning. The first night of January 1899 brought cold that made seasoned frontiersmen question their preparations. Samuel Hartwell's thermometer read 10 below zero at sundown, but the mercury continued dropping as clear skies radiated the day's meager heat back into space. By midnight, the temperature had reached 15 below. By 4 in the morning, it touched 18 below zero, cold that turned exhaled breath into ice crystals before it could disperse and made exposed skin burn within seconds of contact. In Tom Bradley's cabin 400 yards down the ridge, the iron stove glowed cherry red from continuous feeding. Bradley and his wife took shifts through the night, one sleeping while the other maintained the fire with split juniper every 45 minutes. The stove's heat output fought a losing battle against infiltration through log joints that had seemed tight during autumn's mild weather, but now leaked precious warmth into the bitter air. Frost formed on the interior surfaces of the cabin's north wall despite the roaring fire just 8 feet away. Ice crystals grew around nailheads driven through the logs during construction, each metal point conducting cold directly through the wooden barrier. At 2 in the morning, Bradley allowed the fire to burn down slightly, exhausted from the constant feeding routine. Within an hour, the interior temperature had dropped from a barely comfortable 65 degrees to 50 degrees. By 4 o'clock, when fatigue finally overcame vigilance and both husband and wife dozed fitfully, the cabin's interior had fallen to 38 degrees. The wash basin near the door showed a thin skin of ice. Water in the coffee pot had frozen solid despite sitting just 3 feet from the stove. The Hartwell Hogan operated under entirely different thermal dynamics. Samuel had built his evening fire at 6 o'clock, feeding the central stove steadily for 3 hours until the iron firebox radiated heat in all directions. The warmth struck the earth-covered walls and began soaking into the clay and soil that formed the structure's massive thermal battery. By 9 o'clock, the earthen walls felt noticeably warm to the touch-up to shoulder height. The compacted adobe had absorbed heat equivalent to several hours of continuous burning, storing that energy in its molecular structure. At 10 o'clock, Hartwell allowed his fire to die down to glowing coals. At midnight, he added no new wood, letting the stove cool to barely warm iron. The Hogan's interior temperature, which had reached 72 degrees during active firing, began a gradual decline as the stored heat in the walls slowly radiated back into the living space. But the decline followed the physics of thermal mass rather than the rapid heat loss that plagued thin-walled construction. While Bradley's cabin hemorrhaged warmth through every gap and surface, the Hogan's temperature dropped in measured stages. 72 degrees at midnight, 68 degrees at 2 in the morning, 62 degrees at 4 o'clock, 58 degrees at sunrise, still 20 degrees warmer than Bradley's cabin after 8 hours without active heating, and nearly 40 degrees warmer than the outside air that registered 18 below zero. The thermal mass that neighbors had dismissed as wasteful dirt was performing exactly as Navajo builders had designed it to perform for centuries. The tons of earth covering the structure absorbed heat energy during firing periods and released it gradually over many hours, maintaining interior temperatures that fluctuated far less dramatically than conventional construction. Clay and adobe possessed heat capacity roughly 4 times greater than wood per unit volume, meaning the Hogan's walls could store 4 times as much thermal energy as an equivalent thickness of log construction. At dawn on January 2nd, Hartwell stepped outside his earth-covered door to check conditions and found the air so cold it seemed to burn his lungs. His thermometer read 22 below zero, the coldest temperature ever recorded on his claim, and approaching the record-breaking lows being registered at military posts across Arizona territory. Ice fog hung in the valley, where moisture from springs and stock tanks had frozen and sublimated directly into the air. The sound of splitting wood echoed from neighboring cabins as families struggled to maintain interior warmth against cold that exceeded their worst-case preparations. Bradley's cabin showed the strain of fighting superior thermal forces with inadequate tools. The family had burned nearly a quarter cord of wood during the single night, feeding their stove every hour in a desperate attempt to maintain livable conditions. Ice had formed on the interior of their door despite constant firing. Their children slept fully dressed under every blanket the family owned, and still complained of cold that penetrated their bedrolls. The adults took turns sleeping and tending fire, neither achieving proper rest nor adequate warmth. The Hartwell family had slept comfortably under normal winter bedding with their stove completely cold for the final 6 hours of darkness. The Hogan's interior temperature at sunrise measured 55 degrees, cool enough to require warm clothing, but nowhere near the freezing conditions that plagued their neighbors. Most remarkably, the earthen walls still felt warm to the touch near the stove area, indicating substantial heat energy remained stored in the thermal mass. Hartwell restarted his fire with kindling and a single split log, bringing interior temperature back to comfortable levels within 30 minutes. The responsive heating occurred because the thermal mass worked in both directions. Just as it released stored heat gradually, it also absorbed new heat efficiently, warming the living space without first having to overcome the thermal deficit that plagued cold-soaked conventional construction. News traveled quickly across the scattered homesteads as neighbors checked on each other's survival. The Bradley family had burned more wood in one night than Hartwell typically used in a week. Other conventional cabins reported similar consumption rates, with families realizing their winter fuel supplies would disappear within days if the extreme cold continued. Some had already begun rationing wood, allowing interior temperatures to drop dangerously low to preserve their remaining supplies. Yet the strange octagonal structure that neighbors had mocked as the mud igloo continued operating efficiently. Hartwell's fuel consumption remained unchanged despite outdoor temperatures that had broken every previous record. His family slept warm, woke comfortable, and faced each brutal morning with confidence that their shelter would protect them regardless of how low the mercury dropped. The thermal principles that governed earthen construction were proving themselves against the harshest test the high plateau could provide. Mass defeated thin walls. Stored energy outlasted rapid combustion. Indigenous knowledge, borrowed respectfully and applied carefully, was keeping one family warm while conventional wisdom struggled against physics it had never been designed to overcome. But the Great Arctic outbreak had not finished testing the limits of frontier survival. The second wave of Arctic air struck on January 4th with a ferocity that exceeded even the previous night's brutal temperatures. Samuel Hartwell's thermometer bottomed out at 26 below zero just before dawn, a reading that would have seemed impossible to Arizona Territory settlers just weeks earlier. Wind accompanied the cold this time, driving across the exposed plateau at 20 miles per hour and creating wind chill conditions that could freeze exposed flesh in less than 2 minutes. Tom Bradley's family had already pushed their cabin's heating system beyond sustainable limits. 3 nights of extreme cold had consumed nearly half their winter firewood supply, and the constant stoking routine had left both adults exhausted and irritable. Their children complained of persistent cold despite sleeping next to the stove, and ice continued forming on interior walls even when the fire burned at maximum output. The thin log construction simply could not retain heat efficiently enough to overcome the massive temperature differential between inside and outside air. On the morning of January 5th, Bradley made a decision that revealed how completely conventional wisdom had failed against unprecedented conditions. Rather than continue burning through his remaining wood supply in a losing battle against physics, he allowed his fire to burn down to coals around 2 in the morning and did not restart it. The family huddled together under every available blanket, gambling that shared body heat and residual warmth from the stove's iron mass would carry them through until sunrise. The gamble failed catastrophically. By 6 in the morning, the cabin's interior temperature had plummeted to 12 degrees above zero. Ice had formed in the water bucket sitting just 4 feet from the banked stove. Frost covered every interior surface, including the family's bedding. Bradley's youngest child showed early signs of hypothermia, lethargy, confused speech, and uncontrollable shivering that indicated dangerous core temperature loss. 400 yards away, the Hartwell Hogan demonstrated the profound difference between thermal mass construction and conventional building techniques. Samuel had fired his central stove the previous evening from 6 until 9 o'clock, following his established routine of heating the earthen walls to their absorption capacity. At 9:30, he had allowed the fire to die completely, not even maintaining coals through the night. His family settled into their normal sleeping arrangements with confidence that the stored heat in 23 tons of earth and clay would maintain comfortable conditions regardless of outside temperatures. The Hogan's thermal performance during the most extreme night of the Great Arctic Outbreak validated every principle that indigenous builders had refined over generations of high-altitude survival. Interior temperature at midnight measured 66 degrees. At 3 in the morning, it had dropped only to 61 degrees. At sunrise, with outside air at 26 below zero and wind howling across the plateau, the Hogan's interior registered 58 degrees, nearly 40 degrees warmer than the neighboring cabin that had been actively heated just hours earlier. More remarkably, the earthen walls still radiated perceptible warmth when touched near the central stove area. The thermal mass had absorbed so much energy during the evening firing that substantial heat remained stored even after 9 hours without any combustion. The clay and adobe construction was releasing its stored energy at precisely the rate needed to maintain livable conditions through the longest, coldest night in Arizona Territory's recorded history. At 7 in the morning, as pale sunlight began touching the frost-covered plateau, Bradley appeared at Hartwell's east-facing door. He carried his youngest child wrapped in every blanket the family owned, and his wife followed with their remaining children. Their faces showed the exhaustion of 3 sleepless nights fighting a battle they could not win with the tools frontier wisdom had provided. Hartwell opened his door to air that was warm enough for normal conversation and movement. The contrast struck the Bradley family immediately. Stepping from 12-degree air into nearly 60-degree warmth felt like entering a different climate zone. The children stopped shivering within minutes. Bradley's wife began unwrapping the blankets from around their youngest, whose color and alertness improved rapidly as core body temperature stabilized. The Hogan's interior revealed construction principles that conventional cabin builders had never encountered. The sunken floor created a natural bench around the perimeter where sleeping pallets could be arranged against walls that radiated gentle heat. The octagonal layout positioned every sleeping area within 8 feet of the central heat source, while the earth-covered walls eliminated the cold spots and drafts that plagued rectangular log construction. Most impressively, moisture control had been built into the system. No condensation frosted the walls despite housing multiple families, because the earthen construction managed humidity naturally. Word of the refuge spread quickly among the scattered homesteads as neighbors checked on each other's survival. The Mackenzie family from the claim to the north arrived by mid-morning, their own cabin having dropped below freezing despite continuous firing. The Hendersons followed in the afternoon, carrying their infant daughter and admitting that their firewood would not last another night at current consumption rates. By evening, 12 people crowded into the 22-foot diameter Hogan that had been designed, like traditional Navajo dwellings, to accommodate extended families during harsh weather. The social dynamics inside the earthen structure reflected the complete reversal of community opinion about indigenous building techniques. Men who had mocked the Hogan as primitive were now studying its construction details with newfound respect. They measured the wall thickness, examined the clay and straw composition, tested the warmth radiating from surfaces they had assumed would be cold and damp. The evidence was undeniable. Every conventional assumption about proper frontier construction had been proven wrong by the most basic test of survival effectiveness. Samuel Hartwell moved through the crowded Hogan without triumphant speeches or pointed reminders of earlier mockery. Instead, he demonstrated the operational principles that made earthen construction superior to conventional methods, banking heat into the walls during evening fires, then allowing the thermal mass to maintain comfortable temperatures. Through the night, managing moisture through natural clay absorption rather than fighting condensation with inadequate ventilation. Positioning sleeping areas to take advantage of radiant heat from walls that continued warming the interior long after flames died. As the longest night of the Great Arctic outbreak deepened toward its second day of unprecedented cold, 3 families slept comfortably in a structure their conventional wisdom had dismissed as foolish waste of time and materials. Outside, wind drove the temperature to 28 below zero. Inside, children slept without extra blankets, while their parents finally achieved the rest that had eluded them since the crisis began. The thermal mass that neighbors had called a mud pile was proving itself the most sophisticated survival technology on the high plateau. The Great Arctic outbreak finally broke on January 10, 1900, leaving temperatures that merely touched 0 degrees feeling almost tropical after a week of record-shattering cold. Samuel Hartwell's neighbors emerged from their survival ordeal fundamentally changed in their understanding of what constituted proper frontier construction. The men who had mocked his mud igloo now walked the perimeter of the Hogan with measuring sticks, examining wall thickness and asking detailed questions about clay composition and thermal mass principles. Tom Bradley was the first to act on the hard lessons of that brutal week. By late February, he had begun excavating earthen berms against the north and west walls of his cabin, packing clay and straw around the log structure to reduce heat loss through the most exposed surfaces. The modification was crude compared to integrated earthen construction, but it cut his firewood consumption by nearly 30% during the remaining winter months. More importantly, it eliminated the interior frost that had plagued his family during every previous cold snap. The Henderson family took a more dramatic approach. Rather than retrofit their existing cabin, they began planning an entirely new structure for the following winter. Henderson had spent 3 days studying the Hogan's octagonal layout and questioning Hartwell about roof construction techniques. By spring, he had staked out his own earth-covered dwelling, slightly larger than Hartwell's original, but following the same thermal mass principles that had proven themselves during the crisis. His neighbors no longer called such projects wasteful overbuilding. Maria Begay and her family had watched the Anglo settlers' winter struggles with the patient interest of people whose ancestors had solved these problems generations earlier. When Hartwell thanked her husband for the knowledge that had saved not just his own family but several others, the older man simply nodded. The Hogan techniques had never been secret. They had always been available to anyone willing to observe and learn. The tragedy was how many winter settlers had suffered through thin-walled construction when better methods existed just across the valley. Word of the thermal mass construction spread beyond the immediate ridge community through the practical networks that carried survival information across frontier settlements. Freighters and mail riders carried stories of the earth-covered house that had outperformed every conventional cabin during the worst cold in territorial memory. Trading post operators, always alert to techniques that might improve their own remote buildings, began asking questions about construction details and material requirements. John Lorenzo Hubble, whose trading post in Ganado served as a commercial hub for both Navajo and Anglo communities, was among the first to apply Hogan principles to Anglo construction projects. During the summer of 1900, he supervised construction of a guest house that incorporated traditional earthen covering over a log frame, oriented with an eastern entrance and designed around a central heating system. The structure provided comfortable accommodation for visiting traders and government officials while requiring significantly less fuel than conventional frame buildings. At Oljato Trading Post, being established near the Utah border, the Anglo trader commissioned a traditional Hogan specifically for overnight guests who arrived during harsh weather. The decision was purely practical. Hogan construction cost less in materials and labor than frame buildings while providing superior thermal performance in the high desert climate. Visitors consistently commented on the stable temperatures and efficient heating compared to conventional accommodations at other remote posts. These adoptions represented more than individual building choices. They marked the beginning of a gradual shift in construction practices across the region where Anglo and Navajo communities intersected. Practical people copied what worked, regardless of its cultural origins, when the alternative was suffering through preventable cold or consuming excessive fuel resources. The thermal mass principles that had kept Navajo families comfortable for generations slowly began influencing Anglo ranch and trading post architecture. The scientific principles underlying earthen construction would not be formally documented by engineers and building researchers until decades later, but frontier builders were already discovering the practical applications through direct experience. Adobe and compacted clay possess thermal properties that conventional wood frame construction could not match. High heat capacity allowed earthen walls to store substantial energy during heating periods. Low thermal conductivity meant that stored heat released slowly, moderating interior temperature swings. The combination created naturally stable indoor climates that required far less external energy input than thin-walled alternatives. Modern thermal analysis would eventually quantify what Hartwell and his neighbors learned through brutal experience during the Great Arctic Outbreak. Earth walls 12 to 18 inches thick could delay outdoor temperature changes by 8 to 12 hours, keeping interior spaces 10 to 20 degrees closer to comfortable conditions without active heating or cooling. That thermal lag time was precisely what allowed the Hogan to maintain livable temperatures for 2 full days after the last wood had burned, long enough to survive fuel shortages or weather conditions that made fire maintenance impossible. By 1905, earth-covered construction had become sufficiently common in the region that territorial newspapers began featuring articles about the new building techniques being adopted by progressive ranchers and traders. The articles typically credited Anglo innovation and adaptation to local conditions, rarely acknowledging the indigenous origins of the thermal mass principles being applied. But the practical results spoke clearly enough. Families who built with earth stayed warmer in winter and cooler in summer while consuming significantly less fuel than conventional construction required. Samuel Hartwell's grandchildren would grow up considering the Hogan the most comfortable house they had ever known, superior to later frame houses that required constant heating and cooling to maintain tolerable conditions. The earth-covered octagon remained the family's primary winter residence well into the 1920s, when modern heating systems finally made conventional construction reasonably comfortable during extreme weather. The broader legacy of that brutal winter extended far beyond individual building choices. It demonstrated that survival on the frontier demanded humility about the sources of practical knowledge and willingness to learn from people whose families had solved local problems through generations of experience. The settlers who prospered in harsh environments were those who recognized that indigenous techniques often represented sophisticated solutions rather than primitive practices. On the ridge above the reservation line, where neighbors had once mocked a man for building like his Navajo teachers, the lesson was carved in clay and earth that still held heat decades after conventional wisdom had failed. The oldest rule in building had proven itself once again. If you build with the land and listen to the people who have outlasted the weather, you do not have to keep the fire going all night.